The letter was 3 years old, its edges gone as soft as cloth, and Eliza Cormier had read it so many times she no longer needed her eyes to find the words. She kept it folded inside her Bible, between the Psalms and the Book of Ruth, as though the placement itself were a kind of prayer. Her father had died in the spring. Her mother had gone the winter before that, coughing into a handkerchief until there was nothing left to cough. And so, at 22, with a schoolteacher's certificate and a small trunk of books, Eliza Cormier had done the only sensible thing a clever, penniless woman in Hartford, Connecticut could do. She had answered an advertisement in the back pages of a matrimonial paper from a rancher in the Wyoming Territory named Thomas Averley, who wrote that he needed a wife and that his house had 2 empty rooms and a view of the Wind River Mountains that a person could look at for the rest of her life and never tire of it. His letters had been kind, not showy, not full of poetry, but kind in the way that a man is kind when he does not think anyone is grading his sentences. He had told her about the winters, so she would not be surprised by them. He had told her that his mother's rocking chair still sat by the hearth, waiting for someone to use it properly. He had asked in his second letter what her favorite flower was, and when she answered foolishly, she thought afterward that she had always loved larkspur. His third letter had come back with a pressed larkspur bloom folded inside it, gone flat and papery, but unmistakably blue. She had shown that flower to her landlady with the pride of a woman who has finally been chosen by something. She had not shown anyone the fear underneath it, the fear that came from being a schoolteacher who had buried both her parents and had nothing left in Hartford to keep her, and everything in Wyoming to lose. The train ride took 4 days. Eliza spent them at the window, watching Connecticut's green hills flatten into the brown immensity of the plains, and then rise again into the sharp, indifferent teeth of mountains that seemed to regard the train and her hopes, and her one good traveling dress with total unconcern. She had memorized his description of himself from the final letter. "I am not a handsome man, but I am an honest one. I will be waiting at the Larkspur Crossing Depot with my hat in my hand, so you will know I mean to be respectful. Larkspur Crossing." He had named the town's own crossing after her flower, or so she had let herself believe, though of course the town had likely been named that long before either of them existed. Still, it had felt like a sign. The conductor called the stop. Eliza gathered her trunk, her gloves, the small looking-glass she kept for courage, and stepped down onto a platform that held exactly no one. She waited as the sun dropped behind the mountains, and the temperature dropped with it. She waited as the station agent locked the ticket window and touched his hat to her without quite meeting her eyes, the particular courtesy men extend to a woman they suspect has just been humiliated. She waited until the platform lamps were lit, orange and small against the enormous dark, and until the last of the arriving passengers had been collected by wives, brothers, wagons, dogs, until it was only Eliza and her trunk and the long empty ribbon of track, vanishing east, back toward everything she had given up. She did not cry. She had promised herself on the train that she would not cry in public, not for this, not for a man who could not be troubled to meet a train he himself had scheduled. She sat very straight on her trunk, her hands folded in her lap, and stared into the dark with the specific dry-eyed dignity of a woman holding herself together by main force. It was in that stillness that she heard the horse. He came at a walk, not a hurry. A big bay gelding with a man on its back who sat easy in the saddle the way men do when they have spent more hours of their life mounted than not. He drew rein a few yards off and studied her for a long moment without speaking, the brim of his hat throwing his face into shadow. "Ma'am." His voice was low and unhurried, gravel worn smooth by wind. "Last train of the night's already left." "I am aware," Eliza said, and was proud of how steady it came out. He didn't ask who she'd been waiting for. He didn't ask why they hadn't come. He simply swung down, boots striking the platform boards with a quiet thud, and stood there with his hat still on his head, taking her in the trunk, the good dress gone dusty from 4 days of travel, the spine held unnaturally straight. "There's a boarding house 2 streets over," he said. "Widow Callahan keeps it. Clean rooms, decent supper. I can carry your trunk that far if you'll allow it." She looked at the black road leading into a town she had never seen, in a territory she had crossed a continent to reach. For a man who had not come, she had, in point of fact, nowhere else to go. "Thank you," she said. "I would be grateful." "Name's Caleb Whitfield," he said, and touched his hat brim and hefted her trunk onto his shoulder as though it weighed nothing at all, and started walking. She fell into step beside him, and neither of them said another word until the lights of Larkspur Crossing rose up out of the dark like something being lit, one window at a time. Widow Callahan's boarding house was plain and warm and smelled of wood smoke and baking bread, and the woman herself, broad, gray-haired, sharp-eyed in the way of women who have run their own establishments for 20 years and taken nonsense from no one, looked Eliza over with the same assessing, not unkind gaze the whole territory seemed to specialize in. "Caleb Whitfield," she said, "what have you brought me?" "A lady in need of a room," he said. "Put her week on my account." "I couldn't possibly," Eliza began. "You could," Caleb said, not unkindly, and was gone before she could argue further, his horse's hoofbeats fading into the dark the way he himself seemed to prefer fading quickly, without ceremony, leaving only the fact of his kindness behind him like a coin left on a table. That night, alone in a narrow bed with a quilt that smelled of cedar, Eliza allowed herself, finally, to weep. Not loudly, just the slow, silent kind of weeping that comes from a woman who has been foolish and knows it and cannot yet forgive herself for it. She wept for the larkspur, pressed flat in her Bible. She wept for a rocking chair by a hearth she would now never sit beside. And underneath all of it, quietly, she wept from the particular terror of being alone in the world with no one left who was required by blood or law to want her. The week that followed passed in a haze of quiet mortification. Eliza earned her keep in Widow Callahan's kitchen, scrubbing pots and mending linens, and learned, in the way one learns things from a woman who runs the only boarding house and the only post office in a town of 400 souls, that Widow Callahan knew everything about everyone and said nothing about anyone unless it served a kindness. Eliza saw Caleb Whitfield only once that week, from the boarding house window, tying his horse outside the mercantile, his face set in the same unreadable, weathered lines. He did not look toward the house. She felt, watching him, an emotion she could not name and did not examine. On the 7th day, he came to see her. He stood in Widow Callahan's front parlor with his hat in both hands, filling the small room the way certain men fill rooms not with noise, but with sheer stillness. "Miss Cormier," he said, "Widow Callahan tells me you kept school back east. Good hand with figures and letters both." "I did. I do. I've got a ranch 4 miles out," he said plainly, as though confessing to a crime. "And a ledger that hasn't been touched proper in going on 3 years. I am no hand with numbers, and it's got past the point where I can pretend otherwise. I've a room off the kitchen you could use of a day. I'll pay a fair wage, and your board here stays on my account till you're settled." It was not romance. It was a rope thrown to a drowning woman, practical and honest and utterly without adornment, and Eliza took it with both hands. "Yes," she said. "Mr. Whitfield. Yes, I'll do it." His ranch sat in a green fold of land under the shadow of the Wind River Range, with a creek running through it that he told her, almost apologetically, never did run dry, even in the worst of August. The very thing Thomas Averley had once promised her in a letter and never delivered. The irony of it sat in her chest like a stone she chose not to examine too closely. Each morning she walked the 3 miles from town as the sun came up pink over the peaks, and each evening she walked back as it set gold behind them, and in between she sat at a battered desk in a small room off Caleb Whitfield's kitchen and did battle with 3 years of chaos receipts crammed into corners, sums scratched out and re-scratched, whole seasons unaccounted for. It was, for her, a kind of joy, a puzzle with an answer, something in the world that could, with enough patience, be made to make sense. He was gone most of the day, out on the range, mending what needed mending, and she knew him mostly by the small evidence he left behind. On the third morning, there was a cup of coffee on the corner of her desk, still faintly warm, with no note and no explanation. It appeared again the next morning, and the next, and became, without either of them remarking on it, a fact of her days, the way the sunrise was a fact of her days, quiet, wordless, entirely reliable. In the afternoons, he sometimes worked within sight of her window, mending harness or sharpening tools, and she found herself watching the economy of his movements, the way he never wasted emotion, the way his shoulders dropped when the day's worst work was behind him. He was a man, she came to understand, who did not speak his feelings so much as build them, plank by plank, the way he built everything else. One afternoon, a month into her work, he set something on the corner of her desk without a word, a small carved fox, its tail curled around its own feet, the wood sanded satin smooth. She looked up, startled, and he only shrugged, a color rising up the back of his neck. "Get restless of an evening," he said, and was gone before she could thank him. She kept the fox beside her inkwell and touched it sometimes, without quite meaning to, the way a person touches a locket. She finished the ledgers in late July, 3 years of disorder resolved into clean, patient columns, and brought the finished book to him on the porch one evening as the light went long and amber over the pasture. He turned the pages slowly, not reading the sums so much as looking at the orderliness of her hand, the neatness she had made out of his neglect. "Don't rightly know what to say," he said. "Thank you, Eliza." It was the first time he had used her given name, and it landed in her chest like a small, warm stone. "The work's done," she said quietly. "There's the pantry wants sorting," he said too quickly, "and mending. There's always mending." And so she stayed, and the arrangement bent itself into something neither of them named. She cooked his supper. She mended his shirts. She set a pot of larkspur, she had found seed for it at the mercantile. On a whim she did not examine on the porch rail, a small blue riot against the gray, weathered wood, and said nothing about it, and noticed, 3 mornings later, that someone had been watering it. The ghost of Thomas Averley had gone quiet and far away in her mind, a foolish girl's fading dream, until the afternoon in early September, when it came roaring back to life. She was in Widow Callahan's front parlor, waiting on a stamp, while the widow sorted a fresh bundle of mail with her usual pursed lip concentration. "Sweetwater Bend," the widow murmured, holding an envelope to the light. "Don't often get anything from clear over there." She squinted at the direction. "For a Mrs. Averley. That'll be from her husband, I'd wager, Thomas. Works the surveying crew out that way. Sends a letter home reliable as Sunday." She looked up, still half smiling at her own small-town omniscience, and the smile died on her face when she saw what had happened to Eliza's. The blood had gone entirely out of it. Widow Callahan, who missed very little, understood everything in the space of a single breath, the matrimonial advertisement Eliza had never once mentioned, the empty platform, the quiet, borrowed shame of the last 3 months. "Oh, you poor child," she said, her briskness gone soft all at once. What Eliza felt, walking back out to the ranch in the low September light, was not the heartbreak she might once have predicted for herself. It was colder than that, and clearer. Thomas Averley had not simply changed his mind, or lost his nerve, or been called away by some accident of fate. He had a wife already. He had written her tender letters and pressed her a flower, and asked after her favorite blooms, all while a woman named Mrs. Averley sat waiting for his letters in Sweetwater Bend, entirely unaware that her husband's pen had wandered as far as Hartford, Connecticut. He had made a game of her hope. The thought of it opened something hard and cold in her chest where the humiliation had been. She found Caleb at the corral, resetting a rail, and told him everything: Widow Callahan, the letter, the wife in Sweetwater Bend, the whole ugly shape of it, in a voice she kept admirably level. He set down his hammer and listened without once looking away from her, and when she finished, his jaw had gone tight and still. "There's a magistrate in Sweetwater Bend," he said, low. "Mail fraud's a crime same as any other. He could be made to answer for it." She had thought of that herself, walking home. She let herself picture it for one long moment, the investigation. her name printed in some circuit paper, herself recast forever as the fool who'd been duped by a married man's letters. And then, quietly, she set the picture down. "And what good would it do me?" she asked. "It won't give me back my pride. It won't undo what's done." The fault for believing him was mine to make, and mine to carry. I'd rather leave it behind me than drag it along. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, the anger in his face giving way to something else entirely, a kind of astonished respect, as though he were seeing the true shape of her for the first time. He had grown so used to the smell of her bread in his kitchen, the scratch of her pen in the next room, the larkspur on his porch rail, that the thought of the house returning to its old silence struck him, suddenly, as unbearable. That evening they sat on the porch as the light failed behind the mountains, and the quiet between them had a different weight to it than it ever had before. "Eliza," he said. She turned. He set his hat on his knee, turning it slowly by the brim, a man gathering his nerve the only way he knew how plainly, without hurry. "This house has been quiet a long while, longer than I let myself notice, till you came into it. The work's finished now. You've no cause to stay on my account." He looked at her directly, the way he looked at weather he meant to read correctly. "But I find myself hoping you will anyway. I find I want you here not for the ledgers and not for the mending. For yourself." He stood and walked to the porch rail, looking out at the dark shape of the mountains he loved better than words. "I never had a way with letters, Eliza. Never could write you a pressed flower or a pretty line about a creek. I've only got this house and this ground and the plain truth of what I feel, which is that it isn't empty anymore, not since you came into it, and I don't want it to go back to being empty again." He turned to face her fully. "I'm asking you to stay on as my wife, if you'll have me." The crickets, the wind in the pines, all of it seemed to fall away and leave only the question standing between them, unadorned as a fence post and twice as solid. Eliza rose and crossed to stand beside him at the rail. He had not offered her a mountain view or a creek that never ran dry, or a flower pressed flat between letters. He had offered her, simply, himself, steady, plain, entirely real, and she understood, standing there, that it was a far better promise than any she had been given before. "Caleb," she said, "I was hoping you'd ask." The smile that broke over his weathered face was the first true smile she had ever seen him wear, and it changed him entirely, the way sun changes a plain stretch of ground. Their courtship, once begun, was as unadorned as the proposal that had started it long suppers where they spoke, for the first time, of the years before they'd known each other. Sunday walks along the creek where he taught her the names of wildflowers and she taught him, laughing, the proper spelling of them. Slow evenings on the porch where two solitary lives wove themselves, thread by thread, into one. They were married in October, in the small clapboard church in Larkspur Crossing, with Widow Callahan standing as witness and dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief she pretended not to need. Eliza wore blue. Caleb wore his one good suit and looked the whole ceremony through, like a man doing the most important work of his life and determined to do it right. 5 years turned over, quiet and full, the way years do on a working ranch. On an evening in early autumn, the light going long in gold across the porch boards, Eliza sat in a rocking chair, the very one, worn smoother now, that had once belonged to Caleb's mother, with a small boy's shirt in her lap and her needle moving steady in the fading light. A girl of 3, dark-haired and serious-eyed like her father, sat at her feet, arranging river stones into careful rows. Caleb came and settled into the chair beside her, with the particular sigh of a man who has done honest work all day and is glad, now, to be done with it, the smell of wood smoke and horse and long sun still clinging to his shirt. Their son came tearing around the corner of the house, chasing an indignant hen, hollering with the pure joy particular to small boys, and Caleb's voice rolled out after him, low with amusement, "Samuel Whitfield, leave that bird be. She's got more sense than you do." And the boy grinned, gap-toothed, and abandoned the chase to lean against his father's knee instead. Eliza looked at all of it, her husband, her children, the porch rail still lined with larkspur, gone to seed, and come up again every summer since, and felt a peace move through her. So complete, it was almost its own kind of ache. The house behind them was no longer silent. It was full of small feet on the floorboards and small arguments settled in the particular, ordinary music of a life fully lived. "The light's lovely this evening," she said softly, and Caleb, looking at her, understood, as he always did now, that she was not only speaking of the sunset. "Still can't credit how long it took me to work up to asking you," he said, a teasing warmth in the words. "You were slow," she agreed, smiling. "Good thing I had someone patient enough to wait on me then," he said, and took her hand, his thumb moving once, gently, over her knuckles. They sat together as the last light drained out of the sky and the first stars came out over the mountains, the house behind them warm and lit and entirely full. Not the empty house a stranger's kindness had once carried her trunk toward, on a night when she had believed she had nowhere left in the world to go, but a different house altogether, built not out of paper promises and pressed flowers, but out of coffee left wordless on a desk, and a small wooden fox, and the plain, unhurried, entirely dependable truth of a good man's steady love. Sometimes what feels like a wound turns out to be a door. Eliza's rejection at that empty platform wasn't the end of her story, it was the beginning of a truer one. Caleb never wrote pretty letters, but he showed up every single morning with quiet, steady coffee. That's the real lesson. Love isn't in the promises we're told. It's in the small, faithful things someone keeps doing for us, day after day. A small note for you, friend. This story was imagined and written by AI, meant purely to entertain and warm your evening, while hopefully leaving behind a little honest, hopeful truth to carry with you.